Okay, Rabbi say. Ready to go. My sincerest apologies for the tardy start. You'll forgive me. Hopefully you'll be so excited when we finish the Shir Gemara you won't even remember we started late. I hope. Spring harvest. All right, so let me tell you what we're going to do tonight. And thank you all for joining online. And let me tell you how we're going to do it, and then we're going to do it. So you know first. We have been mounting a defense of the Torah tradition that the counting of the Omer begins the second day of Pesach. Sadducees, Bythusians, heretical groups trying to dismantle Torah tradition say, that's not what the Bible says. That's not what the Torah says. So we said, no, it is what the Torah says. But on the surface, they seem to have a point. Because on the surface, the Torah's verbiage is, mimacharat ha-Shabbat. It's on the day after Shabbat. And the day after Shabbat, in English, is usually called Sunday. So what's the meaning? Well, Shabbat means cessation. It means a holiday. And we have copious proofs for this, but we're still dealing with the reality that it says Shabbat. And why it would use this unusual verbiage we actually talked about at some length in the previous episode. So tonight we're going to be kind of introducing a new proof per se. And this proof is problematic because the verse is already used for other things, as we're going to point out. But what we're going to do is carefully look at the words of Rashi and suggest that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be problematic. It can actually be straightforward, which I will explain. And then, interestingly, we pick it up where we left off, which is a continuation of the original Brisa. There was an original teaching we started to expound. We get interrupted, and then we go back to that. And this concludes the digest of defenses that are offered on behalf of eternal Torah Judaism. Now, in the next future episodes, we're going to go back and say, are these defenses actually as good as they seem? Are they beyond reproach? Or maybe some of the defense is a little weak. That'll be at a later time, and the Gemara is going to analyze everything and judge each one of the individual defenses on its merits. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to learn the Gemara as it's traditionally learned, and then we're going to look deeply into Rashi, and we're going to ask ourselves the question whether or not the Gemara may be saying something slightly different, which deflects the whole slew of questions that comes up, and I think solidifies our understanding of the Gemara unique way. All right, so with no further ado, let us immerse ourselves in the sea of Talmud, Tom's Talmud Tisch. This is the 9th segment of Counting Days, our series on Sefirat Ha'Oomer from the Gemara. We are studying Masechet Menachot. The page is 66, side A. We already began Daf Samach Vav in the previous episode, and now we are continuing on page 66. And the last thing we heard about was a very familiar argument with accounting that takes place after a day of rest at the beginning of a festival. And so there's kind of a symmetry or corollary that indicates that it's the second day of Pesach. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Elazar, says, Kosuv echad Omer, there is a verse, and this verse says, Sheishet yamim tochal matzot. You should eat matzah for 6 days. Now this verse is found in Deuteronomy, in chapter 16. And as we have discussed a number of times in the previous episodes, there are verses that are found in Exodus, that's at the real-time reportage when we're leaving Mitzrayim and getting the mitzvahs. There are verses that are found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, Kapitel Chav Gimel, which is Parshat Emor, that's called Parshat HaMoadot. And then there is the repetition of Parshat HaMoadot, the portion of the Torah that speaks about the holidays in the book of Deuteronomy. And they're very different. They are not merely repetitious, as you will see. So our Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, there's a verse. The verse is found in Deuteronomy. It's verse 8, and it says, Sheishet Yamim Tochal Matzot. Sheishet Yamim Tochal Matzot literally reads as, for 6 days you should eat matzah. For 6 days. Uvayom HaShavi, and on the 7th day, Atzeret LaHashem. That day is a day that is set aside, a day of, if you will, a cessation or stoppage of the ordinary ebb and flow of life. We get off the rat race. It's Atzeret. Stop everything. We devote ourselves to spiritual service. It's a Yom Tov. So for 6 days you eat matzah, and on the 7th day it's an Atzeret LaHashem, and that means Lo ta'aseh malacha. You shouldn't do any work. Now I'm quoting the rest of the verse. The Gemara does not quote the rest of the verse. The Gemara just quotes Sheishet Yomim Tochal Matzot. Incidentally, what we're about to learn, what we're just reading in the Gemara, is also found in the Sifri. The Sifri is the Medrash Halacha that accompanies the book of Deuteronomy, Numbers in Deuteronomy, and the Sifri says exactly these words, almost verbatim. So the Gemara says, that's interesting. Sounds like we eat matzah for 6 days. And then, V'kosov echod Omer, another verse says, Shivat Yamim Tochelu. And this is a verse out of Exodus. And in this verse, which is found in the 12th chapter of Exodus, it says, for 7 days, Tochelu, you're going to eat this matzah. For 7 days. So what's the obvious question?
Why 6? Why 7?
Hey, it's a 6 or 7. Can the real Passover please rise? What is this? This seems pretty much like an outright contradiction between what we're going to call Deuteronomy and Exodus. Parshas Bo and Parshat Re'eh. And the Gemara says that in 2 words, Ha Ketzad. How does this work? And the Gemara answers like this. The Gemara says, Matzah, she'i ata yachol la'ochla shiva, that we're talking about a matzah that can't be eaten for 7 days. Can't. Matzah that can only be eaten for 6 days. It can't be eaten for 7 days. What does that mean? Why is there a matzah that can only be eaten for 6 days? I mean, first of all, you can eat matzah whenever you want. At least up until Pesach. Some have a custom a whole month before Pesach. Some have a custom 2 weeks before Pesach. But, I mean, like a week, a day before. Certainly, once Pesach comes, you can eat matzah. So what in heaven does that mean? Matzah you can only eat for 6 days. And then, there's matzah sha'ata yechol la'ochla shiva. Then there's matzah you can eat for 7 days. Teach me Torah. What is this? So the Gemara says, Min hachadash, from the new grain. So when we're talking about the proverbial new spring harvest, which is called chadash, from the new harvest, ata yochel la'ochla sheishet, you can only eat it for 6. Why? Because min hachadash, when it comes to the new grain, you can only eat the new grain miyom havi'achem, from the day in which you bring the korban Omer. You can only eat it once you bring the korban Omer. But before you bring the korban Omer, can you eat the new grain? No. Okay. So if matzah is made from the old grain, for how many days can I eat it? 7 days. But if matzah is made from the new grain, I can only eat it for 6 days. Okay, let me explain so everybody understands. We have learned, and we will learn, that the land of Israel is a sacred place, a sacred soil, which doesn't mean that we have to go around kissing the soil or can't live a normal life. It means that the land of Israel, by its very existence, allows us more opportunity to connect to Hashem. Hashem's mitzvahs are holy. What does that mean? It means that by virtue of these mitzvahs, we are able to have a relationship with God. And because we're able to have a relationship with God, how would we view the item or object or behavior or activity through which we can have a relationship with God? How would we view it? We would view it with a sense of endearment. We would cherish it. We would respect it. We would be gentle. Why?
It's like no other place.
So it's like no other place and no other item. So for example, let's say a pair of tefillin. A pair of tefillin it's a very sacred thing. What does it mean it's sacred? Sacred or kadosh means it's designated, set aside. Tefillin are used for one thing and one thing only. And that is to perform a mitzvah. So if somebody says, I have a shelf that needs some propping up. Can you pass me those black boxes? Because if I pile them up, I think I can place the shelf right on top of them. They said, no. What are you talking about? That's tefillin. Guy goes, you can call them whatever you want. To me, they're just boxes. I said, well, let me tell you a little secret. They're not just boxes or black boxes. They're tefillin. They're sacred. So sacred means something which is only used for a particular purpose. And we could have sacred, by the way, in non-holy or religious terminology also. Things which are, designated for. This is funny. Many years ago, we used to have charity golf tournaments. So I was never in a golf course in my life. That's the truth. When we had these golf tournaments, I don't know what I was doing the first year. All I knew is there was lots of people playing golf, and they hadn't put on tefillin yet. That's all I knew. So I got a little golf cart, and I was going from hole to hole and getting everybody to put on tefillin and gave them l'chaim, so they were happy. I was happy, they were happy. Everything is great. And I didn't know that there's a place called the Green. You're not supposed to go. You're not supposed to drive on the green, right? But what do I know? So I'm having a great time. I'm zipping all over and I drive right onto the green. And there was this golf aficionado, like he reminded me of the joke the guy said, he said, I want to join a shul. The rabbi said, oh, that's very nice. Which shul are you coming from? He says, the golf course. This guy worshipped the game. It was like, he goes, Reb Mendel, what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know, just driving on the grass. He goes, oy vey, this is like driving into the Aron Kodesh on Yom Kippur. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that. Okay, now so I backed up as quickly as I could, and from then I never drove on the green again. The green is sacred, right? So we could use sacred in many different ways. Sacred just means that it's designated for a specific purpose. When we say the land of Israel is holy, what does it mean? It means that in this place, we have many more opportunities to connect to Hashem and many more opportunities to bring holiness into this world. And that's why, euphemistically, the word eretz is a permutation of the word ratz, which means to run, or to race, or to be engaged. Ritza, which means also ratzon, desire. Because when you really want something, you run for it. And Eretz Yisrael is Eretz that wants to do ratzon. It's the land that runs or wants to do the will of Hashem. Now, does it mean it's impossible to sin in the land of Israel? Unfortunately, that is not the case. It does mean that mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael are more meaningful, more potent. The flip side, of course, is that a sin in Eretz Yisrael is more damaging. Everything counts for more. Everything is more meaningful in a spiritual God-us relationship. So one of the things that happens in Eretz Yisrael is that the new grain that grows is not allowed to be used by people or eaten by people until Hashem gets some first. Now there is an opinion that says the new grain grown anywhere is not allowed to be eaten by people until, and that's what they say Chodosh, and according to many Rishonim, Chodosh is prohibited outside of Eretz Yisrael as well, and there are lots of people today that are stringent because they can be, and because they say it's a Sveika Deraisa, it's a question, it's a rabbinic question. The Bach, the Bayit Chadash famously ruled that one could be lenient, and there's a lot of stories about that. The Baal Shem Tov, it seems, favored the leniency. Now, once upon a time, beer was considered a basic staple. Don't ask me why beer is a basic staple. I don't understand why that's a basic staple, but ale or beer was a basic staple. And in Poland and Czechoslovakia, you couldn't get beer that wasn't Chodesh. All the beer was Chodesh. So, what, you're going to outlaw beer for everybody? I don't know. Maybe. No, Chas v'sholom, you can't do that. It will be too much for people to handle, and so we follow the opinion, the relatively minority opinion, that Chodesh only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, when the Beis HaMikdash stood, the grain was cut towards the end of the first day of Pesach, and then it was prepared over the course of the night. It had to be prepared because the grain was fresh, and the grain had to become dry. And we've learned about this in a number of different ways over the last couple of episodes. And a korban, a mincha, a meal offering would be brought in the Beis HaMikdash. And after the meal offering was brought, once, if you will, God got a piece of the dough, then everybody could have some of the dough. In today's day and age where we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, so what we do is we wait until the day when the korban should have been brought passes. And once that day passes, we are allowed then to eat from the new grain. And as I said, according to some opinions, this applies only in the land of Eretz Yisrael. According to many, it applies everywhere. Certainly, the new offering can only be brought from the grain that is grown in Eretz Yisrael. So, how's about that I harvest grain on Purim, which is a whole month before Pesach? It's fantastic grain. It's the freshest grain in town. And I do all my things. I roast it and I parch it, and it's fantastic now. And I have such fresh grain, you could almost still taste the husks. And I make matzah. Can I use that matzah for the performance of the mitzvah on the first night of Pesach? Or can I eat it on the first day of Pesach? Think about it. It's made from the fresh grain, the new grain. Can I use it on the first day of Pesach? On the first day, on the Seder night, in Eretz Yisrael? No, I'll tell you why not. Because it's Chodosh. It's the new grain. And the new grain can't be used until a korban is first brought. So, let me ask the question of you again. I take fresh grain. It's harvested several weeks before Pesach. And I make matzah. Can I use that matzah on the first day of Pesach? There's only a yes or a no. Can I use the matzah on the first day of Pesach? What do you say? No. You're right. What do you say? No. Excellent. What do you guys say? Okay. So, if the answer is no, then we go to the next question then. Why not? Because we first have to have that offering. And only after we have that offering can the chodosh be eaten. So how many days of Pesach can that matzah be used for?
6.
Exactly. Because Pesach is 7 days in Eretz Yisrael, and since I can't use it on the first day, how many days can I use it for? 6 days. How about if I have grain or flour that was harvested, that grew last year? I have what's called yoshan, old grain. It's not like it goes bad, it's flour. And I make matzah, which, by the way, most matzah is made from such grain. From wheat that grew before Pesach, the last year's Pesach. And then it gets harvested in the summer. And then it gets turned into flour. How many days of Pesach can I use those matzahs for? And 7, right? Because I use on the first day as well. So you think that the matzah that can be eaten for only 6 days would fetch a higher price or a lower price? Why? I would think lower. I'll tell you why. Because it has limitations. It's like, this box of matzah is very kosher for Pesach. However, it may only be eaten from this date onwards. It's the opposite of today's expiration dates that are found on the groceries. It says, should not be eaten after this and this date. Because that's when all the chemicals that they put into it that makes it last unnaturally for many, many months stops working. Which means it might actually be better for your digestion. But it also might be going bad. Might be rancid. So they say, no good. We are able to artificially extend the shelf life of this food for such and such amount of time, but not longer. And therefore, do yourself a favor, don't eat it after this time. That's what we're talking about usually. That's what we're used to talking about. Here is exactly the opposite. Here is, don't eat this matzah until the second day of Pesach. Until the korban gets brought. You understand how the Gemara answered the seeming contradiction between the two psukim? Gemara says, I don't understand. He telling me a story with 6 days of matzah, and they telling me a story with 7 days. For heaven's sake, which one is it? Do you eat matzah for 6 days, or do you eat matzah for 7 days? The answer is, well, Pesach is 7 days long. Well, if Pesach is 7 days long, you eat matzah for 7 days. Yeah, but the Torah doesn't say 7 days. The Torah only says 7 days in Parshat Bo. But when the Torah was talking to us in Parshat Re'eh, in the book of Dvarim, the Torah said Sheishet Yamim, 6 days. So the Gemara said it's not a problem. We're talking about two different things. We're talking about matzah from the new grain or matzah from the old grain. Do you get it? It's very simple. Let's take a look in Rashi. So Rashi says, if you look in the Rashi, I made you the photocopies. I know it's a little small. Take it as a compliment. I'm treating you like teenagers. So the Rashi is the second wide line. There are 4 wide lines on top, and the Rashi gets narrower. So the second wide line, that halfway through, the Gemara says like this: Matzah she'i ata yachol ochla. Matzah that can't be eaten shiva, min hachodesh. That's from the new matzah. Ata yachol ochla shisha. You can only eat it for 6 days. So Rashi says like this: Shalemachar, because tomorrow as in the second day of Pesach, Yakriv ha'Omer, the Omer korban is going to be brought. Ve'im tamtin, and if you wait, ad la'achar haShabbat, if you wait till after Shabbat, meaning you wait till Sunday, nimtzeit mevatel mikra zeh. Rashi says, then you have abrogated this verse. What is Rashi telling us now? Rashi is telling us, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about the 6 days or the 7 days here? This is not really part of the conversation. Our discussion was, when do we start counting the Omer? That was why are we talking about 6 days, 7 days? I mean, it's very nice. It's fine. It's an interesting business. That's how the Chodesh and Yashan work. The old wheat or old crop and new crop. That's how the business of the special korban in the Beit HaMikdash, which ultimately catalyzes the concept of counting, but the details are not relevant. That's not our discussion at hand. Rashi says, yes, it is. Why? Because what you're really discovering here is another compelling proof that the counting of the Omer, meaning the bringing of the Omer, meaning the harvesting, the spring harvest of the Omer, must take place on the second day of Pesach. And it cannot take place on Sunday. They were saying it's Sunday. Macharat HaShabbat is Sunday, Yom Rishon. And we're saying, no. That doesn't work for us. Because if you do it on Sunday, then in that case, what happens if Chal Pesach b'Sheni b'Shabbat? Let's say Pesach falls out on Monday. Okay, so v'lo tovi ha'omer, they're not going to bring the Omer, because Pesach fell out on Monday. When are they going to bring the Omer? The following Sunday. Exactly. Ad la'achar Shabbat. So if that's the case, how many days is Pesach going to last? Pesach is 7 days. So if they're going to bring it on Sunday, because Pesach started on Monday, how many days will you eat matzah of the new grain? 1. 1. Because Pesach started on Monday. But you won't bring the Korban Omer till Sunday. That means the first day of Pesach is Monday. The second day of Pesach is Tuesday. The third day of Pesach is Wednesday. The fourth day of Pesach is Thursday. The fifth day of Pesach is Friday. The sixth day of Pesach is Shabbat. The seventh and final day of Pesach is Sunday. And it's only on Sunday that you're going to bring the Korban Omer because, hey, you're a Sadducee. You said it says Macharat Shabbat. I said, really? So if it says Macharat Shabbat and it has to be on Sunday, how would you explain these verses? That says that there's matzah that can be eaten for 6 days or for 7 days. It doesn't hold water. No. So pretty clear that the Korban Omer is not brought on Sunday, but the Korban Omer instead is brought on the second day of Pesach. Macharat Shabbat, after the day of Yom Tov. That's what Rashi is telling us. That's what Rashi explains it. Now, Rashi says, "V'lo tovi omer la'achar Shabbat nimtzat shelo tochel matzah chadash." You will not eat matzah chadash, ella oto yom levado. Only on that day. Aha. So Rashi uses a very unusual word. Rashi uses the word nimtzeit mevatel mikrazeh. You're going to undo, you're going to nullify this verse. I'm not nullifying a verse. You're going to be contradicting a verse. You're not going to be keeping a verse. So, Tosfos asks a tremendous question here. Tosfos says, one moment. This sounds very familiar. I seem to remember us using this very same verse for a very different lesson. So if the verse is already used for a teaching, it's not available for a different teaching. So how does that work? What's the teaching? So the teaching, according to the Tosfos, is a Gemara that we actually learned together. We learned this Gemara. It's found in the 10th chapter of Masechet Pesachim, which is called Arvei Pesachim. And it's on page Kuf Chof. It's on page 120. And we have spent a good deal of time on these pages in our series on the Passover Seder, the Talmud on the Passover Seder. So let me refresh your memory. About halfway through the page, Rava makes a statement about matzah in today's day and age. Omer Rava said, matzah bizman hazeh, the obligation to eat matzah in these days, deoraita. It's biblical. It's a biblical obligation. Okay, where do you get that from? So, what about moror? Is that a biblical mitzvah? No, says Rava. No. The moror is only rabbinic. But it says in the Torah you should eat moror. Well, how can moror be rabbinic? So the Gemara says, sure, it says in the Torah. It says that the Korban Pesach should be eaten with matzot umerorim, with the wafers and the bitter herbs. Did you have a Korban Pesach this year? No. So if you didn't have a Korban Pesach, how are you going to eat the Korban Pesach with wafers and herbs? You don't have a Korban Pesach. Oh. Why did we eat maror this year? And the answer is because the rabbis ordained we should. And the question was, when the rabbis made this injunction of eating the bitter herbs on its own, did they say or mean we should eat it with matzah? Or did they say we should eat it just like that? And since we don't know, we eat maror twice. Once alone, and once with matzah, also known as the korech sandwich. All right, so then matzah should also be rabbinic, because it says the korban pesach, the paschal offering, that's meat, is eaten with matzah and maror. And the Gemara says, yes, that's true. However, mihadar hodar bekra, the verse backtracks on this, because the verse then tells us with regard to matzah, be'erev tochlu matzot. In the evening, at night, you eat matzah. Aha. So at night, you eat matzah. It doesn't say at night you eat matzah and korban pesach, which is wafer and meat and maror. That says in a different verse. In this verse it says you just eat matzah. So from this we can see that even if you just got matzah, you still have a biblical mitzvah. That's what the Gemara says. Okay, so is the matzah all days of Pesach mandated? Or is it only on the first night? That is the question. So the Gemara says a little later on towards the end of the page, Tanya Kavasei de Rava, we learned in the image of Rava's teaching that there's a verse that says, Sheshit Yamim, for 6 days you're going to be eating matzah. You all know, we just learned that verse. That's Deuteronomy 16, Parshas Re'eh. Uvayom hashvi atzeret l'Hashem Elokecha. Now, the Torah is giving us instructions for the seventh day. What shouldn't we do on the seventh day? What shouldn't we do? Think. Vayom hashvi, on the seventh day, atzeret l'Hashem Elokecha, a cessation for Hashem your God. And the pasuk finishes off. What does it mean in Atzeret? Lo ta'aseh melacha. Don't perform work. So what shouldn't you do by dint of biblical command on the seventh day of Pesach? What shouldn't you do? Work. Don't do work. What should you do? By dint of biblical ordination, what should you do on the seventh day of Pesach?
Rest. Eat matzah.
Does it say eat matzah?
Doesn't say what we should do.
Doesn't say what we should do. Now, on the first day of or night of Pesach, it says lots of things you should do, like eat matzah, like tell the story, like have a korban Pesach. What happened on the seventh day? What should we do?
Not work.
Just not work. Atzeret. By the way, on Shavuot, what do we do? Biblically. What do we do biblically on Shavuot? Eat blintzes?
Nothing.
No. Grain offerings in the Beit HaMikdash. And nothing really changed after we stopped bringing grain offering. We still observe Shavuot. So what is Shavuot called? What's the name of the biblical name for Shavuot? Atzeret. Do you know why? Because it's got no mitzvah that defines it. Sukkot is called Sukkot because the Sukkah defines the Yom Tov. Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. It's called Yom Hadin. It has something that defines the judgment, defines the day. Yom Kippur is Yom Kippurim. What is Shavuot? Atzeret. Why? Because it doesn't have a mitzvah. Taught the holy tzaddik, Rev Levi Yitzchak Barditchev. It doesn't have a mitzvah. And why indeed, he said? Because Shavuot represents Torah itself. It's not that, Levi Yitzchak said, it's not a detail. It's the concept that there is a God and he's giving you a Torah. And that means you have to obey. What? Everything. Whereas one mitzvah is emphasis on one detail, one facet of our relationship with God. So what I'm trying to demonstrate for you is that the word atzeret means a cessation of work. It's not a calling to do something positive. So the Gemara says, now I'm just trying to think about this logically. If the Torah came along and said, on the seventh day of Pesach, you should do nothing. If on the 7th day of Pesach I should do nothing, it means there's no mitzvah to eat matzah. Because if it would be a mitzvah to eat matzah, I'm sure the Torah would tell me, Atzeret tiyeh lechem v'tochlu matzah. It doesn't say that. So what do we see from this? But what if I'm hungry? Can I eat matzah on the 7th day of Pesach? Knock yourself out. Eat as much matzah as you want. That's called not chovah, not obligatory in Hebrew. Chovah means it's mandated, it's a must. What's it called in Hebrew? When it's not a mandate and not a must, what's it called? Reshut. Reshut means it's elective. You may. I used to have a teacher. The kids would want to go to the washroom. When I was a kid in the States, they called it the bathroom. So if you would say, can I go to the bathroom? She would say, I hope you can go to the bathroom. Is that permission? She said, did you ask for permission? She drove us crazy. What do you mean? I said, can I go? She says, I don't know. I don't know what your plumbing's like. I hope you can go. Are you asking for permission? We'd say, yeah. She was like an English teacher. She would say, well, then the right way to ask is, may I go? I don't know if you can go. So I can never forget the rest of my life. There was a can and may. It haunts me. I don't remember her name, but I just remember that it was can or may, and you always had to ask, may I go? Because if she said you can go, you might be in trouble. She never could answer if you can. Can I eat matzah? I don't know if you can eat matzah. Are you hungry? The question is, may I eat matzah? Certainly, as much as you want. Must I eat matzah? No. No. So the Gemara says, so now what's the logic over here? 6 days of Pesach, right? 6 days of Pesach is like, okay, it says eat matzah. And then on the Yom Tov day, well, do whatever you want. Well, if the Yom Tov, which is a more important day of Sukkot, of Pesach, pardon me, it's do whatever you want, then how much more so than the other days, which are of lesser importance? For sure, I'm not obligatory. By the way, that includes the first day of Yom Tov. There is no obligation to eat matzah on the first day of Yom Tov either. When is there an obligation to eat matzah? On the night. On the night, my friends. Not like all these misguided people are making the Seder, unfortunately, when it's light outside. At night. Night is right. Only at night is a mitzvah. What about the days? It's not a mitzvah. It would make no sense to say. The Torah comes along and tells me, the 7th day, the climatic celebration of the holiday of Pesach, don't do work. And that's all Torah said. That's nothing. No other mandate, no other mission, no other responsibility. So I understand that matzah is reshut. I may, not must. So the Gemara says, if I may, not must, and that includes obviously all the other days. And from this I know that in the 6 days of Pesach, is it a mitzvah to eat matzah? According to most opinions, no. And even according to the opinions that say that it is mitzvah oriented to eat matzah, and you're getting a mitzvah, you're getting closer to Hashem when you eat matzah, is it a mandatory to eat matzah? Certainly not. Certainly not. And the Gemara learns this from the fact that it says Sheishet Yamim. This is all the Gemara in Masechet Psachim on page 120. So as Rashi tells us, it says Ubayom Hashvi Atzeret, and it doesn't say V'lo Ktiv Tochel Matzah. It doesn't say anything about eating matzah. So you see clearly HaTorah Hotzio Min HaKlal. The Torah removed it from the generality, the plurality principle, which includes all days of Pesach. The Torah designated or separated this day. So therefore, the Sheishet Yamim are Reshut. Im Ratza Lechol Basar. What if a person says, well, I'm on Atkins diet. I'm not eating matzah. All right. I am just going to eat meat. All right. You do that. He wants to eat basar b'lechem. It's Yom Tov. You have to eat meat. He says, I'll eat meat. Or he says, I'm one of those spiritualists. I'm gonna knock myself out by learning Torah all day. I don't want to eat it at all. Well, you're going to be hungry, but that's up to you. You can do that if that's what you want to do. Only hitano to pass on the meals, or should be odo. You may. You may. You can observe the holiness of Yom Tov with spiritual pursuit. You can study and pray all day long. Every day except Shavuot. So the Gemara calls this something which was bechlal, v'yotza min haklal, was part of the general rule. Then it went out of the general rule because it was 6 days of Pesach, and then we hear about the 7th day, and then we hear about not eating matzah. From this we learn that you don't have to have matzah at your meals during the 6 days of Pesach, because the 7th day is not mandatory. So Tosfos says, I don't know what's going on here. You're bringing me a teaching about a verse that's supposed to indicate when I count the Omer from Sheshet Yamim and from Shivat Yamim, from the seeming contradiction between the verse in Exodus and the verse in Deuteronomy, where the Deuteronomic verse says 6 days of eating matzah, and the Exodus verse says 7 days of eating matzah. And I'm reconciling the difference by saying, aha, so that means you have to be eating chodosh, the new matzah, for 6 days, but the old matzah you can eat for 7 days. So now I know that you have to bring the new korban and start counting on the 2nd day, not on Sunday. So Tosfos says, but we already have a limud for this pasuk. And then Tosfos brings even stranger. Tosfos brings there's a lesson which is found in Masechet Chagiga. And interestingly, this lesson of Masechet Chagiga is also found in the verses in the teachings of the Mechilta, on the verses in Parshas Bo, and the lesson is that the days of Chol Hamoed, the intermediate days, I am allowed to work biblically. So the Tosfos is like, he's almost compounding it. He says, there's like 2 things being learned from this pasuk already. So what is his answer? He says, Shema tarte shamas minei. Maybe we can learn 2 different teachings from the same verse. And the Tosfos is not even comfortable with this. He says Shema. He says maybe. The Tosfos does not even give us a satisfying answer. And the Mefarshim use extraordinary kinds of acrobatics in order to figure this Tosfos out. Ganze Maisa with a Yerushalmi, and it should be Asay, Dochalos Asay, the positive mitzvah should be able to deflect the negative mitzvah. So if it's a positive mitzvah to eat matzah, I should be able to eat the Chadash matzah on the first day. Then why am I not allowed to? Because it's a mitzvah Asay that was given before the Torah was given. A whole Maisa. And I'm learning this Gemara. I'm saying, 1 second. Rashi wasn't bothered by this. Rashi knew about this. Why wasn't he bothered by it? So I want to make a radical suggestion, and I'm going to tell you that I did not find this. I looked for it. I looked if somebody would say that. I didn't find it. But the way I came to this is that the Rebbe taught us how to learn Rashi, and the Rebbe said that Rashi is pshuto shel mikra, the straightforward, almost simplistic, but it's so simplistic that it's utterly profound. Just a simple, straightforward reading. And the Rebbe also mentioned multiple times that Rashi on the Gemara is pshuto shel Gemara. The Tosfos looks at everything in a complicated, sophisticated way. But sometimes there is the profundity of simplicity. So I would like to humbly suggest, and I'm a little afraid to say this because Tosfos doesn't say this, but then again, Rashi doesn't ask the question. I don't think it's a limud. I don't think this is actually a lesson being learned. I think it's what we would call a matter of fact. It's not a lesson, it's a matter of fact. The lesson that's learned from 6 days and 7 days is whether matzah has to be eaten or doesn't have to be eaten. Fine. That's not what the issue here is. The issue here is, it is a matter of fact that when we are going to bring the korban ha'omer, that we will be allowed then to eat the grain for 6 days. But the grain, the old grain, you can be eating already from the first day, so it's 7 days. It's not the limud, it's not the teaching, it's a matter of fact. It's a matter of fact. And that's why Rashi says, I told you about this, I pointed this out to Rashi before. Rashi says the words, Nimtzeit, it would come out, mevatel mikrazeh, you're doing away with this pasuk. Nimtzeit mevatel mikrazeh. He says, you're doing away with a verse. The verse doesn't add up now. It's not a limud, it's not a teaching. You're doing away with a verse. Here's a verse that says 6 days eat matzah. Here's a verse that says 7 days eat matzah. Even with the whole fancy limud, we still have a contradiction. You made a whole limud as to the 7th day versus the 6 days. Fine, but what about the fact that it says elsewhere 7 days eat matzah? Is that a limud? It's a simple way to appreciate the verses. This verse is talking to us about the distinction between the old grain and the new grain. The old grain you eat for 7 days, the new grain you eat for 6 days.
So it's not a contradiction.
So it's not a contradiction, because it's talking about two different kinds of grain. If I'm right, and I don't know yet, but if I'm right, I did do research. I don't know that I'm not right. This is unbelievable. So Rashi answered the question. Rashi is just teaching us to look at the Gemara differently. If you look at the Gemara not as a limud, not as a learning, but as a matter of fact, it works perfectly. By the way, there's something else we get if you look at it that way. And that is that we started to analyze a verse. We introduced a brisa in the previous class. We interrupted. We brought another teaching in. And then in a minute, we're going to go back to that original brisa. Why did we interrupt with another teaching? Why wouldn't you finish? And the answer is because this little teaching is not a limud. This little teaching is a matter of fact, which will enable us to appreciate what we're about to say afterwards. Because the question is, do we start counting after we bring the korban, or do we start counting after we do the cutting, the harvesting? Is it the counting of the spring harvest, or is it counting of the firstling offering? And you're going to say, well, it's a Sefirat Ha'Oomer. Omer is a measurement. The measurement is used to bring the offering. The measurement is also used to place the fresh grain into a container called an Omer. So this fits perfectly. It's not a deviation where we were having a brisa, we went off on a tangent and introduced a different limud, and then we come back to the original brisa. Why didn't you finish the brisa to begin with? If we look at it the way I think Rashi is looking at it, it's not a limud. It's not an extra learning. It's like a matter of fact. This is like what we call elementary. It's self-understood. Here you have a verse that says you eat matzah for 6 days. Here you have a verse that says you eat matzah for 7 days. The only way that makes sense is if you have the old grain and the new grain. Now, by the way, it's obvious that the korban will be brought on the 2nd day, because if it's brought on the 2nd day, then you have 6 days in which you can eat the matzah. It's that simple. So that's my wild suggestion. That's what came to me after a long time of banging my head against the wall. So I'm trying to figure out the answers of Tosfos, and it's like very mind-bending kind of answers of a whole new way of looking at a positive mitzvah, deflecting a negative mitzvah, and each answer opened new questions. And all of a sudden I said, Rashi doesn't deal with it, because it's not a question for Rashi. And I realized this very unusual expression, mevatel mikrazeh. Nimtza mevatel mikrazeh. That's my humble korban, my humble offering for tonight. So now, if we figured this all out, now the rest of the Gemara is so sweet. Now it like sings off the page. Now that we have this little business of the 6 and 7, if you're following along in the English translation that I made photocopies of, we would be Miyom Haviachem, column 2, where it says the Brisa clarifies other aspects for the time of the offering and beginning of the Omer Count. But what the Brisa is really doing is simply returning to expound the original verse that it was talking about, Leviticus 23. We're expounding Leviticus 23. Now we're continuing to expound Leviticus 23. What did we begin to expound previously in the previous episode? We talked about counting. Who's counting? You're counting, and my counting, and every one of us counting. Sfira l'kol echad v'echad. Remember that? And then we said, Esfartem lechem when? Mimachras HaShabbos. We talked about when Mimachras HaShabbos is. So now we're going to simply continue to expound verse 15 into verse 16. When is that? Miyom, these are the next words in the verse. I'm reading to you literally from the Gemara and from the verse at the same time. Miyom haviechem, from the day in which it is brought. What? The Omer HaTnufa. And here, the Gemara does something unbelievable. The Gemara, which sounds Miyom Haviachem, Miyom Haviachem is a quote of Leviticus 23. The Gemara shifts from Leviticus 23 into Deuteronomy 23, verse 16. And the word is tisperu. Tisperu. Sorry, no. We'll come to 23 in a minute. I apologize. We skip ahead into the next pasuk. We skip from verse 15 into verse 16. And in verse 16 it says, Mimacharat Shabbat tisperu chamishim yom. You should count. So we put together these three words. The first two words are from verse 15. The next word is from verse 16. Miyom haviechem, that's in verse 15. Tisperu is in verse 16. About 10 words in between the two. So when do you count from? Oh, well, how do we know the night before? It says miyom haviechem. Doesn't say that. It doesn't say milayla. It says count miyom haviechem, from the day. So this is actually the question. Well, now we have to figure this out. So the Gemara says, miyom haviechem tispru. Yochel, you might think, yiktzor, you harvest, the spring harvest happens, and after the spring harvest, v'yavi, then you bring the offering. And when should you start counting? When should you start counting? Well, whenever you want to start counting. When can you start counting from? You can't count before this day. I think I'd like to count in 2 weeks. Well, that's fine. Count in 2 weeks. That's the Gemara says. Ve'emasai. I would have thought emasai sheyirtza yispar. I can count whenever I want. Because guess what? The Torah said that this is my counting. Aha. If it's my counting, I'll show you. I'll count when I want to count. I'd love to have a Shavuot in Elul. I think a shofar with cheesecake would be a really great way to... I'm going to count in Elul. Are you crazy? This Shavuot was in the spring. I don't care. It says I can count any time after this. So I count when I want to count. That's not going to work. That's not going to work, says the Gemara. You would think Emasai Sheyitza Yispar, Talmud Lomar, and here the pasuk is going to shift over into Deuteronomy. And the word over there is not tispar. Sorry, 1 second. It's not tisperu, but the word is tispor. Tispor. And I'm talking now Deuteronomy. Now we shift from Leviticus. It's like Gemara can give you almost like a headache. You need a towel on her. We're going to shift from Leviticus, shift into Deuteronomy. So from Leviticus in Vayikra, in Parshas Emer, it says tisperu. You should count 50 days. And then in Devarim, Tezayin, in Kapitel Tezayin, in chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, in verse 9 it says, Shiva Shavuot Tispar Loch. You should count 7 weeks. When do you count 7 weeks? When should you count 7 weeks? It says, I'll tell you when. Mehachel chermesh bekama. From the day the sickle is raised on the tall grass, on the stalks. From the day of the spring harvest. No, you don't count whenever you want. You count, I'll tell you when you count. Shiva Shavuot Tisperlach Mehachel. Mehachel, the mem in Hebrew means from when it begins. Hachel means to begin. Mehachel, from when you begin to count. So when do I start counting? When I raise the sickle. See how the Gemara is going back and forth to two different places? We're going from Leviticus. It's good I don't have it. The roll is like a Torah. It would be confusing. I could have two separate books. I have Sefer Vayikra and I have Sefer Devarim. And I look at the two. It took me a while to figure this out. I look at the two and that makes perfect sense. So, in Chumash, Vayikra, it says, Miyom Haviechem. When can I count from? From the day when I bring it. From that day onwards. Tisperu. But then, we have a verse in Devarim, and the verse in Devarim says, Tisperloch. That's right, it's your count. It's you. You do this. It's your personal thing. Yeah, but when? Not whenever you want. When? Mehachel chemesh bekama. From when the sickle is raised. So I only know what to do because I have Leviticus, I have Chumash Vayikra, because I have Chumash Devarim. One completes what the other starts. Why is one plural and one singular? So a little bit we addressed this in the previous class, the previous episode. But here the point is counting 50 yom, 50 days. And here we are emphasizing that the 7 weeks should be counted for you. Right? So here, there's the business of that's Sfira l'kol echad v'echad. That's the individuals, if you remember the previous episode. Talked about the individual counting. And here, the Tisperlach is a language that sounds like the Bezdin. And in the previous episode, we explained how it is both the Bezdin and the individual. When do you start counting? Well, it depends on Rosh Chodesh is. That's the Bezdin's business. That's the singular. Tisperu, that's the pluralistic. That's when everybody does. That's once we know what the Bezdin tells us. But again, that's where Deuteronomy and Leviticus are working together. It's a synergy of these two separate verses. Yochel Yiktzer, so I say, okay, I get this. I think I'm understanding this now. So I would think Yochel Yiktzer v'yispar. You cut, and as you cut, you start counting. And then, the main thing is, cut and count. But when do you bring the korban? Oh, bring the korban, I don't know, whenever you want. Ve'emas ha'sheyir tzayavi. Bring the korban in July, I don't know. Bring the korban whenever you want. I said, no. Talmud leimer miyoim haviachem. Back to Leviticus. When do you bring the korban? Meyom haviachem, from the day of your bringing. In other words, the safarta lachem imachras haShabbos, the counting is miyom haviachem. So the counting is from the day that you bring. By the way, it's a beautiful point over here. The point is that you count from the day, not from when you bring it. When is the day that you bring the korban start? Think about this carefully. When does the day that you bring the korban start? The night before. The night before. So if I ask you, which day do we make a bracha on the lulav and esrog? When does that day start? The answer is it starts the night before. When can you actually make a bracha on the lulav and esrog? The next day. But the day is the night before. So the day of Purim is a day of great rejoicing. It's the day of Mishloach Manot. It's the day of Matanot Le'Evyonim. It's the day of a great big feast. Can I do that at night? No. Isn't it Purim? Yes. So it's the day of. The day of starts the night before. But technically that mitzvah has to be performed in the day hours, not the night hours. So Miyom Haviecha means the day of it being brought. Says the Gemara, Miyom Haviechem, if it says from the day, Yochel, you would think that Yiktzer, you count, V'yispar. And then you cut, you count, V'yavi b'yom. And then you bring it the next day. Talmud leimer sheva shabbosas tmimois. You have to make sure you count 7 perfect weeks. The only way you can count 7 perfect weeks is you don't cut and count, but you cut and you wait to count until it's dark. So you cut the day before. When it's dark, you count. And then the next day you bring the korban. When do you have 7 perfect weeks? When you start counting the night before. So the Gemara says, Yachal Yiktzer, V'yavi, maybe I have to cut, bring the korban, and then start counting at night. From Deuteronomy, back to Leviticus. No, Talmud Leimer, the Pasuk says, Miyom Haviachem. So this is, like I said, this can give a Tylenol headache. We're going back and forth, right? But the bottom line is, the Gemara says, okay. So, spell it out for me. HaKetzad, how does this look? How does it work? Gemara says, very simple. Ktsira, you cut. Usefira, and counting, balayla. V'hava'a bayom. It's a 3-ring circus. 3 stages. There's the cutting that takes place on the first day of Pesach. Then there's the counting at night on the second day of Pesach. Then there's the bringing, and that takes place during the day of the second of Pesach. And now we look in Rashi, everything is beautiful. So Rashi says, Talmud Lomar, the verse comes in, Miyom Haviachem, what does it mean from the day you bring it? Hochi mashma, this is what it sounds like. Mishiagia, mimacharat HaShabbat. I'm reading the Rashi now. From the day of Macharat HaShabbat comes, Duhu Yom Haviachem, that's the day of bringing the korban. Huchsheru Sfira, you can immediately begin to count Misha Shetirza. O bayom o bachar. Now is the time when counting is appropriate. You may count from here onward. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Talmud lemer, no. The verse, so from there I go from Leviticus into Deuteronomy. It says I have to count mehachel. Mehachel means mashma la'achar katsira, after the cutting. V'kodem hava'ah, but before the bringing. Because the pasuk says, tisper lach mehachel chermesh. It doesn't say tisper lach mehava'at korban. It says from the raising of the sickle. Raising of the sickle is the spring harvest. Harvest, count. Talmud lomer meyom aviechem. The mashma, you have to bring the carbon lo hochshru sfira elim yeshigia yom haba. It sounds like maybe you have to count the next day. Or meyom aviechem the darshinan hashta the beshlashton uvga echad. It sounds like everything has to be done together. I think maybe all three have to be done that day. Cut on the second day, count on the second day, and offer on the second day. So the Gemara says no. The way to work this out is ktsira v'sfira balayla, the cutting and the counting at night. The ktsira lo sagi, the lo mekame sfira. You can't cut before that. From the time you raise the sickle, the time of the spring harvest. But hava, the bringing is bayom. The chsiv miyom aviechem. The ktsira mekame, the haba, and the ktsira is obviously happening before you bring it. The biyom, the homiyom aviechem ksiva says from the day of bringing it. It doesn't say mishat aviechem. It doesn't say from the time of bringing the carbon. It says from the day of bringing the carbon. The kivan, the chashecha, once night falls, mi be'erev, yom haviechem hi. Once it's night, it's already day. Friday night is already Shabbat. The night of Shavuot is already Shavuot, and so on and so forth. And so everything works out beautifully. But if you follow this line of logic, it's not like we interrupted the brisa and went somewhere else. We interrupted the brisa with an emphasis on the bringing of the carbon on the second day, which flows. Now the rest of the brisa flows. Now it all makes perfect sense. So you can have the matzah, because otherwise we'd say maybe you can only eat the chadash when you start counting or something like that. So now we know how it works. At night, you cut, spring harvest. Then, Omer counting. The next day is the bringing. It's not a separate drasha. It all flows together. What emerges is a very compelling picture. A picture that tells us that we start counting the Omer, not on Sunday, but on the second day of Pesach. And this concludes our digest of defense. And now that we've concluded bringing all of the defenses, in the future episodes, we're going to say, hey, are those defenses impenetrable? Are they actually all watertight or airtight? Or do some of those defenses leave us open to further attack by Sadducees and by Thusians? But for that, you'll have to come to the next episode, which, by the way, will be next year. Okay, thank you for joining. And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining. I wish everybody who is joining for tonight's class a very, very happy and special, wonderful Shavuot. As the Rebbe used to say, Kabbalas HaTorah b'simcha u'b'pnimius. We should all merit to receive the Torah in a state of joy and with sincerity. And hopefully, we will be celebrating Shavuot with Hashem's help in the third Beis HaMikdash. May it be b'mheira u'b'yameinu speedily and in our days. Amen. Ayasher koyach. And where's that clicker? I don't know. All right. We'll just have to.
It took till the end till I got it.